tonight. Joining us, Hussein Ibish, Communications Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and from New York, Maurice Sonnenberg, former Vice Chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Bill?
Mr. Sonnenberg, you have to excuse me, but I'm a philosophy major from the University of Niagara, so I like to start with a basic principle, if we may, and this one articulated by Georgetown University professor Jonathan Turley, a frequent guest on this show, who says, quote, I'm sorry, it's George Washington University, in this town you can't confuse the two. Quote,
no, you can't.
Here's his quote, "The government does not have a license to violate constitutional rights because there is a national emergency." Pretty basic. After September 11, do you still agree with that statement?
Well, first of all, the premise is it a violation of constitutional rights? I mean, constitutional rights depend on situations and times. I'm not sure that the legislation, in fact, I have a feeling when it goes to court, it's going to probably be sustained. So I disagree with the premise that they're violating constitutional rights. That has yet to be determined. Now, if the question is, do they have a right to put through this kind of legislation that makes it easier to find probable terrorists, well, the answer probably is yes.
Well, let's talk about the legislation just a little bit later and talk about some of the things that are being considered now. And by the way, I never thought that constitutional rights were a question of situational ethics, but the Washington Post earlier this week reported that the FBI is getting frustrated with some of these people that have been detained because they won't talk. And so, according to the Post, the FBI is talking about perhaps going to the use of drugs to make them talk, going to the use of pressure tactics, not defined, to make them talk, or even exporting some of these people to other countries that will use threats against them or even physical torture to make them talk. Do you think those things are over the line?
Yeah, I would think so. You know, you get to the point where if you go look at early films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you remember the black and white films, they'd take the fellow in the back room and they punch him out a bit and they put lights on him for 7, 8 hours until he drops and he talks. I think in these situations, you haven't got that problem here. First of all, the ones who are probably guilty are highly unlikely to agree to anything with that kind of tactic anyway. Now, the last one, that's the more interesting one. Are these people wanted? Are there in those countries that may want them, have them extradited for crimes, possible crimes they may have committed there? In point of fact, that tactic has been used in European countries. I know for a fact that in one country in Western Europe, they told the suspect, look, if you don't talk, we're going to hand you over to another country and they won't be so easy with you. So I'm not sure we're ready for that tactic.
All right, sir.
Now, Mr. Ibish, in the last 6 weeks, you've heard a lot of self-appointed civil libertarians talk as if the federal government is rounding up everyone with a turban, but of course that's not even close to what's happening. There have been fewer than 1,000 people detained, and a lot of them have been detained for good reason. Let me just give you 2 examples. 2 guys, Ayub Khan, Mohammed Asmath, yanked off a train in Texas the day after the attacks. They've got a large amount of cash. They've got box cutters. They've got hair dye. They're using false names. They won't explain where they're going or what they're doing. A search of their apartment turns up information, stories on biological weapons and warfare. Why shouldn't the FBI detain people like this?
Well, really, in that case, I think that they probably should. And they have to determine at some point quickly whether to charge them with a crime or not, unless they can come up with some other rationalization to hold them. Obviously, the circumstantial evidence suggesting that these people might have been up to no good is quite strong. And there's no objection to this element of the investigation from civil libertarians, in my opinion. What the problem is, when it comes to the investigation, is that we really don't know. We don't know how many people have been arrested. We don't know how many people are being detained and under what circumstances and according to what criteria. And we don't know how many of them really have been released. So we don't know exactly what the government is doing. My organization has received in numerous cases of people who've been detained under much more dubious circumstances just because of the way they look, and then were denied counsel for hours and days on end, and other irregularities. We understand mistakes are going to be made, that there's a crisis, confusion, and an emergency, but what we need to avoid is systematic systematizing those mistakes or codifying them in
But
law.
let's just be clear.
Yeah.
When you say irregularities, you're not
Yeah.
saying that they're hung by their thumbs. You're saying
No.
that they didn't have access to a lawyer quickly
right.
enough. But hold on.
What I'm saying is that the government did not follow the law in all of these cases. That the government had behaved, in fact, illegally in some of these cases.
Well, look,
and that's a concern
we do
for
know,
civil liberties.
Hold on. We do know that at least according to the government, and I think we can believe the government in this case, that the vast majority of people who are still being held are being held because they committed crimes.
Well,
immigration crimes.
No, well, hold on.
Or various other crimes. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with it is that when there's a minor visa violation that typically, traditionally, would be resolved with an exchange of letters if someone is slightly out of status for some reason, just because of their ethnicity, to hold them in jail.
What's slightly out of status?
Slightly out of status would be having a work permit to permit you to work for one company and having exchange jobs and ending up working for another company without altering your visa. That's a minor violation. Being here on a student visa and taking some credits but not the requisite number of credits, these are minor matters, and traditionally, typically, they would be resolved with an exchange of letters. There are people who are being detained under such circumstances, and they wouldn't be if they weren't Arabs, and they wouldn't be if September the 11th hadn't happened. Those are questionable. We need to resolve some of those issues.
Mr. Sonnenberg, I'd like to get your... Go ahead. You want to say something, because I heard you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure that Mr. Ibish is quite correct there. I really believe that the government has an intention to take these people and question them, and eventually those people, within the 7-day period, as you know, this new law is going to have a 7-day period. England, for example, wanted to have... Hello? England wanted to have an indefinite period. They, because of the Human Rights and European Commission, reduced it to 7. Now, the use of a crime, let's say a false identification, if there's a necessity to hold someone beyond that, there's nothing wrong with that if they suspect they may be involved in terrorist...
No, actually there is something wrong with that. What's wrong with it is that we need judicial review. You can't just lock someone up based on the Attorney General's say-so. And one of the problems with the 7-day period is that the Attorney General can either charge you with a crime or he can schedule you for deportation. If he schedules you for deportation for any reason whatever, having nothing to do with terrorism or any other criminality of that kind, you still have to be, not you can be, you have to be detained indefinitely. And that period can last for up to 7-8 years, and then if you can't be deported, you'll be detained for 6 months periods of time until the Attorney General wants to let you go. Now that's giving too much power to one man in the federal government to just say, I don't like you, you're locked up, and we're throwing away the key. That's wrong, I think.
I'm not a legal expert on this, but you realize the vote was 98-1. Among the people who voted for it were, for example, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy, a known civil libertarian,
but that doesn't make it right. But that doesn't make it right.
But I think what you're doing
here... The fact that Russ Feingold is the only one with the guts to vote against it doesn't mean everybody else was right.
Well, you may have a point, but on the other hand, I think when you look through the litany of those arguments that went back and forth, they're trying awfully hard to look at both the civil liberties of the very people you're talking about. For example, on my commission, we made a point of saying secret evidence in these trials was not the way to go. You know what I'm talking about, to the Iraqis in Kansas. And I was very strong on that. However, we are in a crisis. We're in a war mode. And unfortunately, there are people, unfortunately, who are brought into a net that perhaps shouldn't be. Now, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to look at it in the very best way to try and give these people the benefit of the doubt. Now, if there's a benefit of the doubt against them, I'm afraid you're going to have to live with that.